Professor Robert May, Lord May of Oxford. He's currently a professor of zoology at the University of Oxford. Quite recently, between 2000 and 2005, he was president of Royal Society. For his work, he was awarded many honors, including Royal Swedish Academy Crawford Prize, as well as Copley Medal and Basel High Prize. Tonight, he will be talking about stability and complexity in financial systems. So firstly, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And please join me in welcoming Professor May.
Right, goodness, I have one of these slides that gradually unfolds, I didn't realize. What I'm going to do is basically talk about complex networks and the way they can behave under disturbance. And I'm going to apply that particularly to aspects of the recent crisis in the financial system, and the dynamics of model financial systems, and some of the lessons and suggestions that they make about how we could regulate things to be a little less subject to hiccups. But before I do that, I'm going to take the liberty of just saying a few random thoughts which I thought might be worthwhile for an audience of people who are willing to give up part of the evening to come and hear a talk about science. And it goes like this. My own life has been a series of accidents. I never set out to be a scientific researcher, and I feel that too often in universities one tends, without intending to give the idea that any student who's interested in science ought to have as their aspiration to become a scientific researcher, preferably in a nice, comfortable university. Whereas I think what one really is trying to do in bringing science into the curriculum is not so much going over lots of things to be learned, but rather communicating a sense of how to ask questions, particularly how to ask questions under uncertainty. And recognize that, well trained in that way, there are many, many different walks in life that you can take that are every bit as valuable and every bit as interesting as being, in fact, a member of the university faculty, the desirability of which is, I think, all too often unconsciously transmitted by people giving lectures like I'm now giving at the moment. And what I'm going to also do is try and give a sense in this lecture of how, if you're alert to opportunities, you can end up doing things completely different from how you thought you were going to end up, which is most certainly the characteristic thread of my own life. And having indulged those narcissistic beginning comments, I'm now going to talk about what I've promised here to talk about. Oh, there's one more thing I want to end talking about, the regulatory implications. This is a slide that I'm very fond of. I think it ought to have much more publicity because to me it illustrates a really extraordinary happenstance of the last 30 years or so that led to the banking crash. It poses really interesting questions about how people didn't recognize there was a problem somewhat earlier. And as you can see, what this is showing is the value of all UK bank assets as a ratio to GDP, so that it's normalized so that it accounts for inflation, beginning in 1880. And you see for virtually a century, although with a few hiccups of the order of 20 or 30%, the ratio of bank assets to GDP went steadily along at about 0.5. And this is very rarely, I have not seen a discussion of this in the economic literature. Around 1970, it started to move up. at an accelerating rate, and just before the crash in 2008, this normalized account of bank assets that had been steady for a century had multiplied itself by a factor of 16. And it is, to my mind, really astonishing that nobody in the banking system who could have looked at that any time over the 40 years up to the crash stopped to ask the question, what's going on and what are the implications of it? And that, I'm going to come back, you're going to see that slide 2 more times. One of the things that I'm going to remark on the way through is, perhaps not my PhD thesis was around 1970, and it was the first big calculation done on the first mainframe in Australia, which occupied a room about as big as this. In the subsequent 40 years, there has been an extraordinary capacity, enlargement in the capacity that things we can compute and handle, and without it, we probably couldn't have got into this mess. And we'll come back to that. But I want to go back a few steps to illustrate this idea of asking the right questions. My switch from being a professor of physics at Sydney to being a professor of biology at Princeton was brought about completely accidentally, in a sense, as an epiphenomenon of the Vietnam War, because in the late 1960s, the Vietnam War had the effect of getting people to ask wider questions about the environment, and I got drawn into social responsibility in science in Australia. And in the course of doing it, and the leader of that thing was the co-author of the canonical ecology text of the 50s and 60s, Charles Birch. And I thought it would be useful to learn about ecology, which I knew nothing about at that time. And it was immediately borne in on me that the very word ecology was only about 100 years old. And indeed, the oldest professional ecological society in the world is the British Ecological Society, which is celebrating its centenary this year. So the subject of ecology is a new one, and the first 50 years were mainly descriptive, and that's sensible. You want to know what you're talking about. But at the time I stumbled into it, at the early 1970s, it had got to the stage where people were beginning to have ideas about what it might be, that how ecological systems work. And in particular, as this slide shows, that one of the most influential figures, Evelyn Hutchinson at Yale, following on work that was done here in Oxford on mice, voles and lemming by Charles Elton, Hutchinson observed what you can read, and I won't read out to you. I don't like people who read out the stuff that's on the screen. You can read it quicker than I can read it. But that was based on a misunderstanding of a paper by Robert MacArthur. And it ran against intuition. My observation is that complicated things usually have more ways of going wrong than helping to make everything steady. And indeed, when I thought about that, I said, well, let me think of some of these. Let me imagine the following ecological circumstance. Suppose I have a community with N species in it. Suppose every one of these species had internal regulatory mechanisms so that if it got above some average number, it would tend to press upon its environment and numbers next generation would be lower. And if it fluctuated low, then it would be in a more spacious environment, as it were, and it would come back. And in short, fluctuations would be damped if this system were, in a sense, isolated. And I would represent that mathematically. And all this mathematics is no more, though no less, than a way of thinking clearly and rigorously. So you'd represent that by saying, I've got a bunch of species, they're not interacting with each other, and the stability matrix, if suppose they're all got these regulatory mechanisms that'll bring them back at some constant rate. So I'll represent that by a matrix, an n by n matrix, with -1s down the diagonal to represent return to equilibrium when you're disturbed. But now, let me put in connections at random. Let me make it that the average number of connections that any one species has to other species has average m such links, and each link can either be positive or negative. They can be eating another species or being eaten by it. That would be plus minus, minus plus, or they could be cooperating, plus plus, or competing, minus minus. And then let me look at the stability properties of this matrix when richer web of interactions. And I was able to prove a really very interesting general theorem for that imaginary, deliberately oversimplified model in the limit of a large number of species. The inherent intra-specific effects would keep the system resilient and recovering from disturbance, provided the product of the number of links and the average square of the strength of the links was less than 1, 1 being this normalizing number of how fast you'd recover if you're on your own. Once beyond that, the system would collapse. And that was completely contrary to Hutchinson's conjectures. And the first thing you've got to remember is that real food webs, of course, are not randomly assembled. And what that did, from a personal point of view, it marked my transition from being a physicist at Sydney to being an ecologist at Princeton, but it essentially redefined the agenda of that particular part of the quest for theoretical foundations for ecology. It redefined the agenda to ask, what are the... I mean, these things aren't randomly assembled. They're the winnowed products of evolutionary processes acting on individuals, thence on populations, thence on ecosystems. But it redefined the agenda as asking, what are the non-random structures that real food webs have that reconcile exploiting all sorts of niches, making for complexity, and yet at the same time remaining relatively robust against the shocks and hazards of the natural world. And the fact that that quest is not a chimerical one is illustrated, I think, particularly nicely by this particular study of recent years by Jennifer Dunn and Doug Irwin at the Santa Fe Institute, suggesting that at least in some respects, like predator-prey ratios, the Burgess Shale community, as you infer it from those fragmentary fossil records, has many properties in common with contemporary ecological structures. And then you have to realise, once you get into this, that it's a good deal more simple than just thinking about the shape of the network. It's not a question of who's connected to whom, of how many connections you have. It's a question of how they're put together. You've got to know not just that there are this many that are connected to 10 other species and this to 3 other species. You really know to what about, are they connected to themselves very connected species? Or to put it another way, in a way that has been much more fully explored in trying to understand the dynamics of networks of infection, you've got to ask, given that there are, for example, in terms of sexual contact, if you're thinking about HIV, there will be some people who have many, many partners and some people who have one or very few partners. And then there's an interesting question. Do the people with lots of partners tend mainly to interact with other people with lots of partners, which would be associative, and the people with just one other partner associate with people with just one other partner? Or is it the opposite? Is it disassociative? So the people with lots of partners actually go around, as it were, predatory on the people with just 1 or 2 partners. That's disassociative. If you want to maximise, and then of course they might just interact at random. So there's no particular pattern. And if you're looking at the propagation of HIV into a previously unaffected group, then if you want to maximize, you want to get the fastest rise in infection, you want things to be assortative. But if you want to maximize the number infected, you want it to be disassortative. So if it's the very active people interacting with the very active people, they will, in a sense, take each other out and leave most of the other people alone. Whereas if it's disassortative, the very active people are working, spreading the infection more widely. And the same sorts of things, that I'm not going to go on and on about, you find as you start to look into the details of ecological communities. But I'm now going to change the direction of the talk again, although more or less for the last time, and talk about the work I've been doing for the last 5 years. And this work derives in many ways from the earlier work, but it's in particular prompted by work with one of my ex-graduate students, a particularly imaginative and creative person called George Sugihara. And George Sugihara and I wrote a paper in 1990 on what might be called the flip side of chaos. Chaos tells you might have a very simple rule, very simple equation that governs what's going to happen in the system you're looking at. You might have a very simple nonlinear equation in which you know all the parameters, and in Newton's ideal world, that means you'd be able to make reliable predictions about the future. But in chaotic systems, there's so much sensitivity to the initial conditions that even if you knew all the rules, you still can't make long-term predictions. Hence, the metaphor, fluttering of a butterfly's wing can change the weather. But the flip side of that is, if with the rise of algorithmic trading rules in stock markets, many of these rules are complicated and non-linear, but well-defined rules. In general, if you have a chaotic system, even though you can't make long-term predictions, by making a large library, and all sorts of jargon words you can dress it up in, of what that system had done in the past, and then looking at what it had just done recently, and looking in your library to see what particular little mini trajectories that look like what you'd just seen did, although they will have eventually all diverged widely, they'll actually give you quite reliable predictions in the short term. Or to put it another way, and the way we illustrated this in the 1990 paper, the first big computation that was done by von Neumann and Ulam after the war in 1948 on the first big computer, MANIAC, in Princeton, used as a random number generator one of the canonical chaotic little equations we have. Next x is a constant times x times 1 minus x. They used that as their random number generator with the constant equal to 4, so it's chaotic. And if you test their random numbers for any ordinary test, it says they're random numbers, but if you used the technique that Georgian had developed and tested, we could tell you the next 2 or 3 or 4 random numbers. We couldn't do much before that. But George parlayed that into running Deutsche Bank securities for 4 or 5 years, making several tens of millions of dollars in bonuses, and then, being George, decided that was more money than he was ever going to need, and he much preferred being in a university, and he went back to the University of California in San Diego to work on multi-species fisheries. But in 2006, before anything had gone wrong in the banking system, rather presciently, the US National Academy of Sciences and their Federal Reserve Bank of New York, made the prescient observation with all the fancy new instruments being created in the financial sector, no one was thinking about possible implications for the system as a whole. And they put together a study on that subject that produced the book that's being illustrated. And in looking out to put the study together, they drew together economists, but also people from other disciplines where there might be read across. People who worked on infectious disease. And George was just perfect. Here is somebody who'd worked in the banking sector, but yet had done a lot of work on dynamical systems. And George got involved, George involved me, and then 2 years later the crash came. One of the things that George was instrumental in, incidentally, and we'll come back to this in a minute, was to say, well, what is the network that connects all the banks in America? And nobody had actually, that was not easily available, so they commissioned a study that looked at the Fed-wire transfer system, of how we send money to our daughter and so on. 9,500 banks, and interestingly, much more than half of all the transactions are associated with just 65 banks. And you get a network like this with a few big banks heavily connected, and then lots of little banks, usually with just a very few connections, a very over-dispersed thing, which is a bit like a lot of plant pollinator systems and is an example of the kind of compartmentalization that helps stabilize random matrices. I'll just leave that up there. You can read that for yourself. I won't read it for you, but basically, it's giving an account, and this is a direct quote from a paper that is recently written by Joe Stiglitz and myself and some people from Zurich. So just trying to give a sense of what these derivatives are. They're really very fancy things, but they are essentially fancy ways of gambling without putting cash on the table. The result that they have is indeed to make the system much more subject to big swings, positive and negative. And on the other hand, it's very hard to work out what's going on because all the transactions are sort of over the counter, not in part of a visible network or visible market that people can form some view of what's going on. And what it turns out is that this sort of system is extraordinarily similar to the things in ecology that I just spoke about, and in particular that little theorem, m alpha squared less than 1 in appropriate units, that I am delighted to say I didn't actually write this bit, these days enjoys the title of the May-Wigner theorem. So this is the phenomenon we're now going to look into a bit more. Part of the reason people didn't really take on board what was going on is these various things. I mean, I may have skipped past the slide. No, I haven't. This is the slide I want. It's some people that should have had more notice taken from them. Warren Buffett is this, I think, the second richest man in the United States. A very interesting man who just essentially doubled the Gates family's foundation, saying he thought they were doing a great job. He wanted to put a lot of money into doing that sort of job, and he thought the best way to do it was give it to the Gates rather than create his own foundation. Extraordinarily unegotistical sort of thing to do. If you really want to follow this a bit more, I strongly recommend reading Warren Buffett's letter to his shareholders in 2002, which you can easily Google. And he had just taken over for Berkshire Hathaway an insurance company that had a lot of these derivatives. And he'd taken one look at them and decided these things were just a dangerous form of gambling, and he got rid of them all. And this wonderful statement, they're financial weapons of mass destruction. Then he explains to his shareholders in very plain English why he thought this stuff was garbage. And meanwhile, the banks were just charging ahead and doing it. up in the Northern Rock, the rich family that owned that bank decided that they ought to get in and go to this casino too, and all the sad things that came from that. The way, in fact, insofar as there was any analytic work on pricing these derivatives, was based on this series of conventional economic assumptions, perfect competition, market liquidity, and so on, which can be mathematized in a very entrancing way, but basically are unfounded on any real factual stuff. I mean, Economics 101 is conducted in a mode of discourse that would be much more familiar to Socrates' Athens than a post-Enlightenment physicist. It's all these sort of statements about things, and then for validation you appeal to authorities. So if you're a lefty, you will appeal to Keynes, and if you're a righty, you'll appeal to Milton Friedman, and if you want to be even-handed, you'll appeal to both, but there isn't much connection with data. There's a very interesting paper that was published in 2009 by a group of Italian physicists in Trieste, and they pointed out that this theoretical basis for derivatives it's not merely a theoretical description of the phenomenon itself, it's actually woven into the assumptions. It just doesn't make sense. And they went on to suggest that if you made a deliberately simplified model of looking at what happens as you make these derivatives and look at the competition that goes on between the financial institutions, you'll come to a sharp singularity which is very similar to the ecological thing that I showed you at the beginning. These kind of things, another great thing to go and look at just for fun, there's a nice thing on Google of the world's 10 best financial bubbles. And you've all heard of the tulips, which is number 1, and the South Sea bubble one, number 2. And some of the other ones, like the Romanian property bubble, I think is a bit of a giggle. But all of these are characterized by things that sort of look like epidemic curves, or they look like what we saw quite recently in the banking system. I mean, what this slide is, and I have to remind myself of this, this is the banks that were the largest players in derivatives, in the derivatives market, and the ones in colour are the 7 largest banks who were into derivatives, and then the black ones down the bottom are a bunch of things that didn't, smaller banks. Interestingly, of the big banks, HSBC is far and away the least involved in it. It basically only lost money in the United States, and that is interesting in that it reflects the Asian origins of HSBC, Hong Kong, which makes it a much more conservative sort of institution. Well, when I encountered all this stuff, I thought it would be interesting to look at, as I've implied already, the relations between this and some of the earlier work in ecosystems. And my first perception, and I should say it is my habit as I get involved in new things, not to learn too much about them at first, because I think otherwise you run the risk, if you get into something new, if you learn all about what's thought, you consciously or unconsciously are canalizing your thinking. I think it's better to think as widely as you can, and then when you have some tentative ideas, then go and read the literature and actually read it. I mean, many people go at a sort of halfway thing and certainly go off independently and often very creatively, and they then cite the relevant literature but don't actually read it. I'm recommending that you go off on your own, but then come back and really read it. So what I did, I thought, this is going to be very different from ecosystems. In ecosystems, the nodes in the network are either you eat someone or someone eats you, or you compete or you help. In the bank, there's at least 4 kinds of things. There are 2 sorts of things that are coming in. Things coming in from outside the banking system, things coming in from borrowing within the financial system. And there are 2 sorts of things going out. Things going out into the world, into businesses and mortgages, and things going out in lending to other banks. And I started to think about that and what it might mean. But before I went too far, I went and asked one of my friends who works in the city. And amusingly, he said to me, oh, that's ridiculously too simple. That makes no sense at all. But here is a paper just written by Andy Haldane and people at the Bank of England, which will point you in the right direction. And so you can imagine how delighted I was when I hunted down this paper and decided that it was a paper that had basically a fairly simple model of looking at the interplay among 20 banks, and these were just model banks, and banks had liabilities and assets. They had 2 sorts of liabilities, of money that would come in, some from deposits in the outside world and from interbank borrowing, and they had 2 kinds of assets, things that went into the outside world and things that went into interbank loans. But this particular model had then been explored by exhaustive simulations, and the basic rule is that the assets must exceed the liabilities. That is to say, there must be some amount of capital reserve held back to cater for loss of value or a loan going belly up or fluctuations in external assets, because if you run into the situation where your assets are less than your deposits, then you're in trouble. And so what I then did with this model is just repeat what the Bank of England people had done by looking at what happened if you put in a shock that caused the bank to fail. Then that loss of value could be this much of it could be covered by the capital reserve, but the remaining, which is an overall loss, will now be distributed among, in the first instance, your creditors. That means they're now suffering a shock, and if that shock is big enough that it is bigger than their capital reserve, there will be a second. This failure will cause subsequent failures. Of course, these effects of that kind of shock propagating are attenuated at each level, because if this bank lost that much, and this much is then projected as a shock to all the people that borrowed from it, say there are Z banks that you've borrowed from, each of them suffers a shock that is this net loss divided by Z. And if one of them fails, it'll be divided by Z squared the next time round. So this is an attenuating shock, but it still can cause cascades if it's severe enough. And what, as I say, the Bank of England people had done is do all this by simulation, but as a crude approximation, I made a mean field approximation. I assumed that you just looked at the average, and I could then get a figure that plotted what I've got here is on this axis, I've got the proportion of the assets that are in bank loans as distinct from external assets. So this is a bank that is purely, in interbank loans. This is the proportion of assets that are in interbank lending. So this is a bank that's just a high street bank. It's just taking depositors' money and putting them out in mortgages. And this is something that's purely a casino bank. And along here is the capital reserve, the net worth gamma, the capital reserve. And now I put in a shock that diminishes the external asset by a factor F. And then I ask questions like that means that if you're inside this big triangle, the first bank will go down. The initial bank, a shock of magnitude F will go down. And you can calculate it would go, that's the critical point. But then I ask how strong a loss of value, sorry, you're left with only a fraction F. How strong a shock has it got to be that as well as the first bank's failure then brings down all its creditors, a set of Z other banks, and a triple thing. In all of this, while it was going on, I had organised with Mervyn King, whom I had got to know accidentally while I was chief scientist. We had at one stage a committee to appoint the next head of the Economic Social Research Council, and it was 3 civil servants, myself as the chief scientist, and a token social scientist. And the token social scientist and I had one view of whom we should appoint, and the 3 civil servants wanted somebody else, and we prevailed. And I thought, this is an unusually wise and skillful social scientist, must have lunch. And it was Mervyn King when he was deputy governor. So around this point, and we had taken to having lunch every 6 months or so, I said to Mervyn King, why don't I bring George Sugihara across and some other people, and we get round and talk about these things. And we did that one evening with some of the people from systemic risk at the Bank of England. And when I showed them this slide, I was unaware of all this Glass-Steagall stuff in America at this point. And they were quite taken with this, because what this says is, if you want to maximise the fragility of the system in this oversimplified way, the thing to do is to have a bank that arranged to be roughly equally represented in interbank lending and external money going out. And that, of course, is what the GlassSteagall Act from 1933 in the United States, passed in the aftermath of the Great Depression, forbade high street banks taking money to the casino. And it was the washing away of that was partly responsible for the crunch in America. And I didn't realise that that's what this was illustrating. And it was a helpful way to get initial feeling on the part of people that maybe this stuff was not wholly useless. But I've gone on since, and I'm not going to go into any more detail, but obviously there's it's a lot more complicated than that. And many people believe that one of the most important factors that drove the cascading of problems, and is not yet fully resolved, was not so much real loss of value in things, although there was quite a bit of that, but just the social dynamics of people feeling more and more nervous and calling in loans and so on. So what we did is go beyond that and say, first of all, in addition to the liability, the money that's come in as deposits or interbank borrowing, and the money that's gone out in interbank loans, we want to distinguish different classes of assets, and we want to keep a certain amount free as liquidity to help cater for accidents. And now we're going to think about what we do when something goes wrong. And first of all, we're going to try and define what we mean something going wrong. So very roughly, just to get a sense of the way things might work, we try, and this is work I did with a person who was here with Angela McLean that some of you may have come across, Nim Arimapathy, a very interesting, very capable infectious disease person, and Sujit Kapadia at the Bank of England. But we characterised the confidence at the level of the entire model system as being the product of a kind of solvency health, the value of all the assets at a given time in relation to their initial healthy value, and the liquidity health in relation to the fraction of the interbank loans that have been withdrawn because other people are getting worried and are calling in their loans. And then beyond that, for the system, we did a similar thing for individual banks. So that this little a, that we define the health of an individual bank, which is the product of the bank's analogue of the capital A for the system, its assets to initial value, and an M, which is the analogue of the liquidity for the system as a whole, the fraction of loans that the bank can settle immediately, either via liquidity or short-term assets. So those are the analogues at the bank level of the system level things. And then we put in some rules that say, if we're dealing with two banks and the product of bank I and bank J's health is less than 1 minus the system confidence level, then both banks shorten their loans. Obviously, if confidence is really high, C will be 1, and this will have to be less than nothing, and so you won't do anything. On the other hand, if confidence is falling, this gets bigger, and you'll be more and more prone to shorten your long-term loans. And if things get even worse, you look at the product of the health of the two banks in relation to 1 minus C squared. If this is getting small, this is getting even smaller, and if this product gets less than this even smaller quantity, then both banks call in all their loans. So this is a very crude way of mimicking what was really going on as a result of confidence effects in the banking system. And the sort of thing that happens, we then look at a model. We've got, for this model now, we've got some big banks and some small banks. It's like that figure I showed much earlier. Nearly all the banks are small banks. For this first study, we've got 200 banks, and 8 of them are big banks, 192 are little banks. All the little banks are identical in the way the proportion of assets and borrowing. The big banks are all similar. The big banks are all 24 times as big as the little banks. They have loans of the same magnitude, because if you're lending from, or if you're lending to or borrowing from a little bank and a big bank, it's got to be the same size. But the big banks have 24 times as many loans. And now we run a simulation in which we administer a modest shock, and depending on the capital ratio, as the capital ratio gets too small, we'll set it so that if the capital ratio falls below that, then a shock on a single index bank that we pick out at random, you'll see one bank fail. But then you'll have to go to implausibly low levels of the capital reserve to get a second failure, but once you do that, it starts to cascade and the whole system comes down. That's not an unrealistic big bank, little bank. In fact, it's not as extreme as the actual American banking system. The American banking system, 79% of all the bank assets in the US are owned by 1.4% of the banks, which is quite astonishing thing. That'd be like redoing this with 200 banks, of which only 3 banks were big banks, and the big banks were 250 times bigger than the small banks. And so we're showing something a good deal more moderate than that. But, I've got something here out of whack. This now is a simulation where we administer a shock to a bank chosen at random, which is big enough to cause that bank, but only that bank, to fail. And what we're doing along here, this is a plot of the capital reserves held by the 8 big banks, 2%, 8%, 10%, and similarly the capital reserves held by the small banks. And then if you could imagine a line going directly back along from this, that would be a line along which the big banks and the small banks have the same proportionate capital reserve. And you will, what is then shown is the failure as you go into the red from being in the blue. In this quadrant here, there are no, the modest shock doesn't cascade, it just affects the initial bank. Might not even affect that. And you can see it takes quite a bit, as long as you have a big capital reserve in the big banks that is significantly bigger than capital reserves in the little banks, the system is in reasonably good health. Conversely, if you have small capital reserves in the big banks, proportionately, even though you have big capital reserves in the little banks, it doesn't take much to bring the whole system down. You can go back now and to this unusually and unknown to us when we did this. There is some data on this done by a chap called Shin at Princeton, who did an analysis, as you can see, of some 5 years of Morgan Stanley data. And what he was trying to address was the thought, in crudely characterized, that the main problem in the recent banking troubles has been confidence and the shortening of loans, the debt part of things, rather than simply the asset sort of things, the mortgages and the like. It was more confidence affecting borrowing and freezing borrowing. And he was testing whether that supposition held up if you analysed the data from Morgan Stanley. But what we were able to do, having had no inkling of this data to begin with, we could go back to our model and construct what our model would have said if you'd treated our model as if it were Morgan Stanley, as it were. And very gratifyingly, it produced just the same sort of picture that this rather unusual, atypical for the general subject, analysis Shin had done did. And we were rather chuffed by that. And what we're trying to do at the moment is to go back into this quadrant, which is before the crash, of what were the conditions that set things up for this to happen. And we're thinking of how we're going to go about that. Also, just before I leave this, and I'm nearly finished now, this is further indicating if the initial failing bank is a small bank, then that initial single failure, doesn't really do much. It'll be very unlikely that more than 4 banks will fail as a consequence. Conversely, if the initial failure is one of the big index banks, it won't necessarily bring the whole system down. Half the time, it will do quite a bit of damage. I mean, there are 200 banks, it'll bring about a quarter of them down. But equally, there's a non-trivial probability to bring the whole system down. It's just really emphasising the disproportionate importance of big banks. The fact of the matter is, in general, and commonsensically, you don't need mathematics for it, large capital reserves give greater robustness to the system. But more importantly, the big banks ought to hold relatively bigger capital reserves because they're more dangerous. Whereas in the run-up to the crisis, the fact is that the big banks held relatively smaller capital reserves. And the arguments that were going on with the Bank of England, the banks were defending what they were doing by simply observing that their capital reserves were absolutely bigger than the little banks, which is a nonsense argument because they may have been absolutely bigger, but that's because the whole bloody bank was absolutely bigger. On the other hand, I mean, there is a natural propensity. In boom times, everybody wants their money working. So in boom times, banks have a tendency to run down the capital reserves. Whereas in boom times, when you're on that upswing, you ought to be increasing the capital reserves. And that's still a sort of contentious thing that the finance bill is currently not even addressing particularly strongly. Another thing you can do, as Haldane has observed, Andy Haldane is the Director of Systemic Risk at the Bank of England. He is no relation to JBS Haldane, first thing I asked him, but he said he's looked hard trying to establish one and he continues to live in hope. He really is very good, and indeed, if you find any of this interesting, I highly recommend one of his most recent papers. If you go into the Bank of England site and Google "The Dog and the Frisbee," there's a characteristically beautifully written essay begins by explaining why dogs are better at catching frisbees than humans, and then it goes on to elaborate how many of the proposed newer regulations are going to make things worse rather than better because they're too complicated. But I digress. This is just another picture showing what went on the road to the crash, and it is showing for various of the banks that ran into trouble just how high the leverage levels were. By leverage levels, what is along here are the bank assets, and up here is the ratio of the way they had leveraged with an amount X of capital. You had thus put 20x or 40x or 60x into the casino of derivatives and the like. The colours reflect how badly the bank was affected, and the biggest banks are identified for you. Yellow is the worst. Oddly enough, dark blue is the next worst, and then green, and then various paler shades. But you'll see that it is not an attractive picture, and it doesn't speak a great deal for the caution of the people who put themselves in that position. Another idea that seems to make a lot of sense, if you remember the first few slides that pointed out that so much of this over-the-counter trading, nobody really knows what's going on. It's not very transparent. It would be much better if there were a visible way of checking what people think about things. But more to the point, if you had central clearing, you could have, where it had to be done through some central fulcrum, then you could very often have situations where A owes B, B owes C, and C owes A, where you could, instead of going through individual 3 separate settlements, there are efficiencies that you can gain. And one of the few mathematical papers that I've seen in this general area, where the mathematics isn't really there just for effect, but really proves a rigorous theorem, is there is a rigorous theorem you can prove. If you're going to have central clearing of counterparties, you want one focus for doing it. Obviously, if you're trying to get all the stuff together, you want to get all the stuff together. Although it's acknowledged to be a good idea, there are now, I think, at least 3 of these things in Europe, 3 in the States, and more striving to get off the ground, which is another illustration of the fact that even when you know what are things that will help, there are often countervailing things that people would rather do it differently. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, modular organisation, things of trying to put things in smaller lumps, as it were, just as it helps, apparently, in many instances, is found in ecological systems, and it echoes GlassSteagall. It might be that that's something that we ought to be thinking about more, and the finance bill is doing that. And in short, I want to end by coming back to this again and I'm just curious, how many in the audience, if any, have read Michael Lewis's book, The Big Short? Yes, I reckon if anybody who does find this interesting, I highly recommend it, and it was recommended to me by people like Mervyn King. And it is the story of a group of young traders who saw that these derivatives, if you put together great lumps of triple B mortgages and put them all together and wave the magic wand of the central limit theorem over them, they would be transformed magically into AAA. It's just complete bullshit. And they then had difficulty trying to run the cash to take a short position on these things. And they eventually did, and they made some money. But in the end, they're all sitting around talking, and one of them says, were the people who were doing this stupid, or were they crooks? And there's a darker character in the novel, an older bloke, Vinny. And Vinny says, most of them were stupid, but some of them were crooks, and the crooks tended to be higher up. It's a really good book. And finally, I want to refer to a very interesting essay that was written almost exactly 12 months ago by the other Friedman, a very distinguished economist at Harvard. And he did a fascinating analysis. He began, I seem to have skipped one of my own slides. I've got it in the wrong order, or did I go past it? Sorry, I went past it. He observed that, and I'm not quite sure what this means, that 30 years ago, the cost of running the banking system in the USA was roughly equivalent to 10% of all profits earned everywhere in the USA. 15 years ago, halfway to the present, that had grown to be 20%. And just before the crash, it was over 30%, which led him to say, after all, it's not as if the financial system's a bad idea. The rise of the West owes itself to banking. You know, the Industrial Revolution, building on the advent of experimental science and so on, for that to propagate and create the world, the prosperity of the West, starting with still a rather feudal arrangement of wealth, the banking system drove the Industrial Revolution. But its basic purpose is to allocate capital efficiently in a free market, not to spin off most of what it's doing in dirty big bonuses. And so Friedman says the time has come to ask how much it's costing us to operate this system and have a good hard look at it. And I wanted to go back and say that's what I wanted to say about this curve, because what I think, I've not seen any satisfactory explanation of this, other than, I've not even seen the observation that you could only have done it with increasing computer power, because many of these derivative things, if you did them as a conventional contract, as you saw earlier, would have run to 1 million pages. But what was really happening here is these same assets were being spliced and diced and recounted, and every time they were recounted and recounted again, somebody was, as the jargon in the trade is, taking rent. That is to say, taking bonuses for this. That is the basic explanation for that bizarre phenomenon. And that's what I think leads us much to come back to Benjamin Friedman. And I'm just leaving up some references if people want to see them. And if anybody who has had enough should feel free to walk out. And anybody who wants to ask a question or two, I'm happy to answer it.
So there seem to be some interesting similarities here to percolation theory. You have a network, something is spreading across it. So Nimpati comes from epidemiology, where I assume you have some similarities here. But is there a more clear link to what we know in the statistics of percolation to this?
Yes, there is in fact, although I can't give you I can't offhand place it, but there are some people who have done things on percolation theory and this. it really, there's a lot of read across, both from infectious diseases and from ecosystems, but at the same time, one does have to realise that there's a lot of differences too. And I've made perhaps too much of the similarities.
Could you say what's happened to your graph now? We've got, because we're 4 years on from that, from the end. I was just curious to, what's happened?
It's a very good question, and my strong impression is that it's well, sorry, we do have a bit of a notion of it. I should have, that was the overall graph, but if I go back many, many, many times. That's what's happening. This is bringing us to 2011. And you can see that these are most of the big banks that we bailed out. They had crash, and now what I would like to see, I would have liked to see them continuing. I would have liked to see them continuing to come back down to here rather than to head back up there. It's not saying that there's another disaster in the offing, and I think that the sort of things that are going on now, and the argy-bargy about John Vickers, the report from I forget what he's called, the warden, but the head of All Souls, John Vickers, who headed up the Independent Banking Commission, the Finance Bill is seeking to implement many of his recommendations, and they're all in the direction of sort of flattening these things out.
So most of your talk, you seem to sort of take the financial system pretty much as it is, ripped, as something as you know, that's how it is. But then at the end, I think you sort of gestured to the possibility that maybe there might be a different way of doing it. And I was wondering if you've come across the work of someone like Positive Money or Michael Robotham, where the idea is that the big problem with the current financial system is that banks have the power to create money in the process of loan making, and that a lot of these problems might be, well, that some work could be done towards solving these problems if we transferred that power to some kind of governmental organisation where the interest is to keep the amount of money stable rather than create more and more loans, because that gives you more money to bank. I was wondering
I think it's a very good question if I've understood it right. I mean, it's basically saying that it ought to be harder to create money, and it's a little destabilising if you can help get people out by just printing more money. And if that is that the gist of what you were saying?
Well, you say printing, it's more that so what function plays a role of money in our economy is essentially the numbers that appear on the liabilities of bank issues. So the money in my account is a liability the bank has to pay me money. But whenever a bank makes a loan, all they do is they type someone's numbers into an account, they register that as an asset, and then when that person pays another bank, that will go down as a liability. And because the banks have the power to give out as many loans as they're confident to give out, they also have the power to basically control the amount of money in the economy, which means that the amount of money in the economy is a sort of radically fluctuating quantity, and typically increases a lot because when banks create money, they have the power to then charge interest on that loan. And the general idea behind that is that, so for instance, that graph you had where the line was going up and up, the problem was that because banks were continually creating money, for instance, in loans and mortgages, that was just increasing the amount of money in the economy, which then increased bank assets.
But you've got to remember that one of the things I do find myself a bit tricky, while it was going up, that was just a picture of the bank assets. But after all, at the end of the day, every one of those assets is counterbalanced by a liability. So when we were looking at the models with a clear line down the middle, you're looking at both sides, but it's quite conventional to look at bank assets in relation to GDP, for example, and there's no reason they shouldn't go along flat. But on the other hand, there is a pathological reason why they should just sort of go up. But even while they're going up, there's liabilities against the assets all the way time they go up. So I don't think it's quite as simple as reorganising how you keep the books. I think it's more a matter of asking, setting aside, given the prices that are being put on the derivatives and things that need to be simply more realistically calculated, is my simplistic feeling. But I may have, there are corners of all this that I feel quite confident about, but the question you just asked me, I don't feel confident about the answer.
Do you think that having a larger number of smaller big banks would make the system more stable rather than having a very small number of extraordinarily large banks?
I think the system would be a great deal more stable. I mean, if all the big banks were more or less like HSBC and were really much HSBC without the American branch, which is where they lost money, and they're getting rid of it. I should declare an interest. I have an association with HSBC. But yes, I think it would be better if you didn't have such a lopsided thing. But on the other hand, if you could implement the guidance of the Vickers Commission that said that by virtue of that the big banks have to, amongst other things, I think probably the single most important thing is that the big banks have to hold relatively larger capital reserves. And during the crash they were holding relatively smaller capital reserves. And yeah, that isn't high-flying science, that's just simple common sense. And the only argument against it is greed. And but it's not easy. It's not clear how the legislation going through is going to go through with the present government. I'd be much more cheerful if the Labour Party were. And I'm not a conventional Labour Party supporter necessarily.
Would you agree that profit maximisation is destabilising? Would you agree that profit maximisation is destabilising because it might be good for individual firms,
Yeah.
but it creates this sort of, and if so, what sort of practical way is there of encouraging,
Well, there are a variety of initiatives that would address some of these things. For example, the suggestion that decisions made at shareholder meetings about bonuses shall be legally binding. If that gets actually enacted, and it'll get a lot of opposition, it might be helpful. But even that, there's a bit of a problem, because my first reaction to learning about some of these things is, how come for years the shareholders haven't been complaining about nearly all the bank's profits disappearing in bonuses? And it was explained to me that the people who come along to the stockholders' meetings are largely fund managers of pension funds and the like, who have their snouts in a similar trough. So, but if you could combine, the real shareholders, recommendations at meetings being legally binding, that would help that would answer quite a bit of Benjamin Friedman's objection as to 10 going to 20 going to 33% of all the profits having funny things happen to them.
Wouldn't you agree it's gone, the problem is such that it's gone really beyond regulation? To put it right, you can't just...
Well, you could do various regulatory things that would do it, but whether they'll be feasibly implemented or not, I don't know. And in addition to that, I remember about a couple of years ago now, much closer after this, I gave a talk at the European Economic Association meeting, happened to be in Glasgow, and the Bank of England had a session. And one of the people who spoke in that was the director of the Royal Bank of Scotland. And he was most annoyed at the fact that a couple of people felt that the bonus that he was just again going to pay himself after the wreck he'd made, he felt quite unapologetic about. And also there is the, and it's really unusual that not many businesses are run in that way. And as I say, all these things are things that are being thought about and there are recommendations about them, but it's not clear how it's going to end up.
Just a quick question. So say I was to speak to someone who was in derivatives trading and asked them...
Sorry, my hearing's not what it should be. Yeah, yeah.
Say I spoke to someone who was actually in derivatives trading and asked him, what value do you think you're adding to the economy beyond putting money into your own bank? What kind of answer could they give me?
I'm sorry, I haven't got the question.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So basically, like, what is the point of derivatives trading? Is there a good answer you could give?
Yeah. Well, of course, the given reason for it was in one of the most meaningless mantras that I've ever come across. You're taking the risk away, you're handing the risk over to people better able to manage it, whatever the hell that meant. But the idea of combining these things and then selling them was just so that you were doing dodgy mortgages. There was a feeling, somebody apparently convinced other people that the individual mortgages were all uncorrelated. And so if you put them in great packages, that would make them much safer because any one dodgy mortgage would be not so attractive. But if they all had sort of 1 chance in 10 of failing, and then you put a couple of hundred together, you're not going to lose all that much, and a lot of people can get houses. The trouble is, it's all that rests on the assumption that mortgages are uncorrelated, which is just crazy. And it would have been, if you could think of a way, you can see some of the drivers of the mess did have a well-intentioned basis, although I don't think many of them did, because some of them were, in tough times, how do you enable people to get a house when houses are expensive and they don't have much money? And it just seemed like a way of taking much bigger risks and indeed giving mortgages to, and I've forgotten the acronym, the people with no jobs, no money, no income, NIMBY. And I suspect some of the people really were genuinely well-intentioned, but I suspect also other people quite cynically knew what they were doing, and they were, in this conventional euphemism, taking rent generously from doing it.
Okay, so before we go, I've got 3 short announcements. I believe there should be some refreshments upstairs, and next week we will be hosting a man legend, Professor James Binney. He's going to talk about foundations of quantum mechanics. And after the talk, we will have committee elections, so if you're interested in running, and once again, thank you so much for coming.